First, I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us for this presentation of why there's no future in STEM and what we can do to fix the problem. Now, if you've ever attended any of my other webinars, you might be shocked by the title, There's No Future in STEM, as most of my presentations are always focusing on strategies for developing sustainable STEM programs that are cost-effective, while also developing rigorous academics that tie into the core curriculums. So this presentation may come as a bit of a surprise to some, as it's a radical departure from what I'm normally presenting. Now you may ask, why contradict yourself? Why go from talking about ways to develop STEM programs and then say that there's no future in STEM? And that's a valid point. And the answer is simple. It's easy to look at what others have done well and to try to emulate it, but we never see how difficult it was to get to that point. So what I really want to do in today's presentation is to critically assess and evaluate the nature of STEM education. And I think that's a very important notion because we can learn a lot more if we take the time to analyze and evaluate what went wrong and why. Therefore, this presentation is not so much condemning STEM, but really serves as a way of looking at what we've done wrong in the past so that we don't make those same mistakes in the future. And that's the moral of this presentation, what we can do to fix the problem. But before we can fix the problem, we need to take the time to understand it. Now, even though my work is centralized in China, the themes and examples that I'll give you today represent a truly global perspective. So I'm confident that everything that I'm about to cover will be applicable to you regardless of the geographic region that you may be working in. And with that in mind, I'd like to start by sharing a Chinese proverb. If your plan is for 1 year, plant rice. If your plan is for 10 years, plant trees. If your plan is for 100 years, educate children. And with that in mind, that's where we begin. A plan to educate children to become more creative, to become critical thinkers, and to pursue a dream that will one day lead their countries towards greatness. So let me start by telling you a true story. Now, it may not seem relevant at first, but I assure you it is, so bear with me for a moment. So I want to start by sharing a story about my sister's path to becoming a successful businesswoman. So she graduated summa cum laude in finance and economics from one of the best universities. And after graduation, she applied for a job at the national headquarters of the largest insurance and investment company in the country. Now, it was no surprise that she landed the interview, got the job, and started her 6-month training program, and there was also about 50 other successful applicants who were hired at the same time as her. However, she was surprised to find out that she was the only person that was hired with a degree in finance and economics. So she asked her hiring manager why the company didn't hire more people with relevant degrees and qualifications. And their response was that they intentionally avoided it. The company specifically tried to avoid hiring graduates with a relevant university degree. And that might come as a surprise to a lot of you. Now, what's the moral of the story? Well, the company knew that everything the candidates had learned was likely no longer relevant or applicable in the current operational paradigm of the modern financial market. So they needed to retrain the candidates regardless of what prior learning they already had. So in essence, the finance and economic graduates learned case studies from past events, analyzed multiple hypothetical models, and they always had the benefit of hindsight when modeling data. Students had learned about policies and regulations that may no longer be applicable to the current marketplace. And as a result, what the students had learned influenced their decision-making process, and this pre-established conceptual paradigm was often detrimental to the employee's success. Essentially, they had a flawed operational paradigm. Now, what was the cause of this perceptual paradigm? Well, so many of the finance and economic graduates had established a paradigm of looking at historical data, analyzing hypothetical alternatives, and analyzing the merits of possible solutions to historical case studies. This resulted in a phenomenon known as paradigm paralysis. Now, this is a term that was coined by Joel Baker, who has popularized the concept of paradigm shifts in the corporate world. In this context, these individuals were so used to looking at historical data in depth and coming up with numerous hypothetical solutions that they ended up being incapable of acting on anything because they were essentially paralyzed by indecision as they tried to come up with numerous different solutions to the same problem. As a result, the company knew that these individuals were typically incapable of effectively looking at live or current data and making informed decisions that would have a positive impact on wealth. Now, I'd like you to keep this story in mind because I am going to come back to this idea later in the presentation. So let's take a look at our agenda for today's presentation. Now, the first thing that we want to do is to develop a deeper understanding of our own thought process. That is, we need to understand our own paradigms and how these paradigms shape our own understandings of how we perceive things such as the world around us. Next, we need to analyze the true nature of STEM education so that we can go and evaluate our own educational practices to see if what we've done is actually representative of STEM education or if it's something completely different. And then we need some actionable recommendations to help us start implementing change. So these are the 4 big ideas that I'm going to cover in today's presentation. So let's start with big idea number 1, understanding our own paradigms. Now, while everyone's coffee is still hot, I want to ask you a question. How many of you like a rich, full-bodied coffee? Now, it sounds quite nice, and if you're going to sit through a long presentation, you probably want a good cup of coffee with you. Now, there's a reason why I asked you this, because I want to give you a real-life example of a paradigm. So there was a large study that was done in the 1970s, and it found that most Americans liked a rich, full-bodied coffee. However, the study actually found that most Americans actually liked a weak, watered-down coffee with lots of cream and sugar. So the study revealed something very interesting. People's perceptions of what they wanted is often very different from what they actually wanted in reality, and this discrepancy is shaped by our paradigms. Now, telling someone that you like weak, watery coffee with lots of cream and sugar goes against what we believe we should like. Whereas telling someone that you like a rich, full-bodied coffee just sounds right. It sounds like what we should say. And most of the time, we're not even aware that we're doing this. It's completely subconscious. And this kind of disassociated response is shaped by our paradigms. Now, you may ask, why is this relevant? Why is this guy talking about coffee in a presentation about STEM? Well, what I found in STEM education is that the reality of what people think they want and what they actually want are 2 totally different things. And this is particularly true of parents and administrators. And I'll get to this idea later on in the presentation. So let me give you some case studies because this phenomenon is not unique. It happens throughout all aspects of life from business, education, religion, and politics. But the ideas are completely transferable, and they will help us understand the nature of our own assumptions. And that will help us when we move on to critically analyze our perceptions of STEM education. So in the 1970s, Howard Motzkowitz was commissioned by Pepsi to develop the best product. Now, when the data came back, it was scattered beyond belief. There was no bell curve, and there was nothing that could be used to indicate what the best Pepsi product should be. Now, the recommendations that were made by Motzkowitz were as follows. You cannot make the best Pepsi. Instead, you need to create a series of Pepsi products that would cater to different market segments, even if they didn't know what they wanted yet. Now, this idea was unheard of at the time, so Pepsi rejected the findings because it went against everything their past successes had taught them. It went against their established paradigms. Now, I'd like to fast forward a few years. Motzkowitz goes on to take his revelation to Prego, who at the time had limited market share in the United States. Now, in his studies for Prego, Motzkowitz experimented with 45 different spaghetti sauce formulations, and he found that people generally fell into one of 3 categories. Those who liked plain spaghetti sauce, those who liked chunky spaghetti sauce, and those who liked spicy spaghetti sauce. Again, this research study revealed that most people did not actually know what they really liked until they were given the opportunity to challenge their own assumptions, and this was because they were caught in a particular paradigm. After all, it's what people expect you to say, and most people believe that they should like a traditional Italian spaghetti sauce, because admitting that you like something that isn't authentic just doesn't sound right. However, the reality of the fact is that most Americans' palate is very different than the average European's. So again, we see people's perceptions are very different from reality, and this discrepancy has been shaped by their paradigms. But before this time, business and customers alike were not aware of this phenomenon. As a result, companies were not innovating because they were trapped in this idea of business as usual, and this is how things have always been done. Moreover, customers didn't really know what they liked until they were given the opportunity to explore different product offerings. And as we saw with Pepsi, they only wanted to look at how to make the best singular Pepsi product rather than looking at innovating. And why did they not want to innovate? Because the obvious solution was different than what they had always done. It went against their established paradigm. And this made them incapable of perceiving the data that was presented to them by Motzkowitz. So the result of this case study? Well, Prego went on to become the most successful spaghetti sauce company in the continental United States. And this was because they acted on the research that was presented to them. And they tried something that no one else had ever done before. Now, in hindsight, the idea of creating different product offerings to cater to different market segments seems incredibly obvious. But this was a new and novel idea at the time, and no one had done it. So you might ask, what happened to Pepsi? Well, after witnessing the success of Prego, Pepsi went on to make some changes. In 1977, they hired John Sully. In 1978, they experimented with new flavors. And in 1980, Pepsi goes on to capture the #1 spot in sales. So it took a while to realize that their decision was wrong. And this was because they couldn't conceptualize the recommendations that were made by Motzkowitz because the data didn't fit into their perceptual paradigm. Now you might be asking yourself, how is this related to STEM education? As these examples illustrate, most people's perceptions of what they think they want and what they actually want are two very disassociated concepts. And this holds true to our perceptions of STEM education. Moreover, our entire perception of STEM education is shaped by our paradigms, and as we've seen, paradigms can blind us from the truth, no matter how obvious it can be. Furthermore, we all have very different pre-established paradigms, and that makes it very difficult for us to develop a common language and understanding of STEM education. As a result, we often see that there's a lot of confusion surrounding STEM education, and that is one thing I hope to alleviate by the end of this presentation. So we definitely need to address this issue and to develop some common language and understandings of STEM education before moving on. But what is a paradigm? So let's talk about what a paradigm is, because I keep using this word a lot. Now, according to the dictionary, a paradigm is a pattern or a model. And this doesn't give us a lot of information. But if we take a look at it in more detail, paradigms essentially establish boundaries, which is what a pattern does. They also go on to tell us how to be successful within the boundaries of a given model. Now with this in mind, I'd also like to quickly review a study by Thomas Kuhn, who researched the effects of paradigms in science. Now Kuhn made an interesting discovery with his research. In essence, he found that paradigms acted as filters that screened information from the scientist's mind. Information that supported people's perception was easily accepted, while information that conflicted with people's perceptions was often ignored. And why was this? Because the data did not match the individual's pre-established paradigms. Now, sometimes the data would be ignored. Sometimes it was manipulated to fit into what was expected. And sometimes, and I quote here, the scientists were physiologically incapable of perceiving the unexpected data. And we actually saw this with Pepsi. They were unable to accept the data that was presented to them because it went against their paradigm. Essentially, the board of directors was psychologically incapable of accepting the new data and analyzing it and drawing a conclusion from it. Why? Because the data that they were presented did not fit into their existing paradigms. And this happens with STEM education as well. Our paradigms often prevent us from taking the time to stop, analyze, and evaluate our own assumptions. So we become trapped within the established boundaries of our paradigms. We never question the nature of our thought. And this is important for us to do as teachers, as we need to question the nature of our own knowledge. But more importantly, we need to move beyond a rudimentary knowledge of what STEM is so that we can develop a deeper understanding of the true nature of STEM education by questioning our own assumptions, by challenging our pre-established paradigms. And that brings us to big idea number 2, where I'd like to develop a shared paradigm of STEM education with you. Now, I know I just warned you about the dangers of paradigms, yet here I am saying that we need to develop a shared paradigm. The key thing here is that we're looking at developing a shared understanding of STEM education in which we can develop our discussions so that we're speaking the same language. But more importantly, it's so we can build a common framework in which we can use to critically reflect and analyze our own understandings. And we need to do that so that we don't fall victim to the trap of paradigm paralysis, which happens when we do not question the nature of our own assumptions. And that's the reason why we need to develop a common perceptual paradigm of STEM education at this point. So let's talk about STEM. What is STEM? Now, to answer this question, we need to review our own history. We need to understand where STEM came from and why it's important. So although STEM would not exist as an official acronym for many years, the events that led up to its creation are as follows. On October 4th, 1957, Sputnik 1 was launched into space. And this was really the catalyst that sparked the STEM movement nearly 40 years prior to when STEM would officially become an acronym. But this is essentially where it all began. Now, the space race set off between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, the Soviet Union would initially dominate during the early years of the space exploration, and I could cite numerous examples. However, the United States would eventually surpass the Russian Federation. And this really happened on July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to walk on the moon. Now, you can see this great accomplishment, which was 12 years in the making, for America to really catch up and surpass the Russians. Now, innovation in space travel did slow to some extent after that, but we did see it continue. And in 1998, we saw the launch of the first module of the International Space Station, where different nations started collaborating in space for the first time. And you also started to see the idea of STEM taking hold internationally at this point as well. So the impacts that the space race had on education were profound, and you'll see the effects of this point in history resonate for decades to come. Now, the space race of the 1950s and 60s essentially united the country behind a common goal. And this led to the development of excellent vocational and technological education programs, or VTE for short, in the 1970s and 80s. Now, this time frame also marked the height of corporate R&D in the United States as well, until 1997 when the share of business research started to decline. This was also coupled by the fact that many teachers who were part of this initial wave of education innovation were also approaching retirement age. And that is something I'll be talking about shortly. Now, the VTE programs did continue well into the 90s when they reached their zenith before they started to decline. And this was also about the same time that corporate research in the US also started to decline as well. Now, these two issues are completely unrelated to one another, but they'll have a compounding effect on the US economy and education. As a result, the economy and many VTE programs started to take a turn for the worse in the late 1990s. However, we did see the introduction of the specialist high-skill major programs, which acted as a bit of a precursor to STEM education. Now, the SHSM incentives did try to breathe new life into some of the aging VTE programs of the day. However, the support this program provided was short-lived, relatively localized, and it did not have the same impact that the official introduction of STEM education would have in the years to come. Now, as I mentioned on the previous slide, by the late 1990s, many of the VTE programs that schools were offering were starting to stagnate. Teachers were approaching retirement, and businesses were not conducting as much R&D as they had in previous decades. And all of these factors would put in motion a series of events that would have a profound effect on the US economy and subsequently education. By the turn of the century, multiple government reports were indicating that the United States was falling behind in a number of sectors that were critical to the economy. And although the acronym did not exist yet, these sectors were science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now, not to state the obvious, but the fact that students in the United States were trailing in these sectors was bad for the economy. And this really illustrates the idea that the goal here is to make sure that the nation continues to be a leader in innovation. And this really comes down to the need of any country to protect its own economic interests, and more importantly, so that it can protect its own national sovereignty. So in 2001, Judith Ramley formally introduced the acronym that we know today. Now, I would argue that STEM was really just an extension of the VTE programs of the 1970s through 1990s. However, there was one big difference. Vocational programs ranged in nature. Some were really aligned to the development of job skills for a labor market, while others were geared towards critical sectors in the economy such as computer and electrical engineering, technological design, and so forth. So STEM was not all-encompassing of the VTE program offerings, but it does take the best of what those programs had to offer. And this helped to bring aspects of the VTE programs into mainstream education. However, by 2005, another report comes out revealing that student proficiency in STEM was still falling further behind other nations. So again, we see that America is still falling further and further behind, and this is after being a world leader for so many years. And this is not what we want to see. Now, this results in a number of criticisms against STEM education, and these criticisms only continue to grow as America continues to fall even further behind. And in 2008, Georgette Yackman introduces STEAM to address a number of perceived shortcomings in STEM education. And I really want to reiterate this notion of perceived shortcomings with STEM, because I'm going to get to this in just a moment. So let's take a look at what's wrong with STEM. Well, STEM means something very different to a variety of different stakeholder groups. For instance, STEM means one thing to governments, particularly as they look to develop a strong economy, but also as a tool to protect their national sovereignty. It also means something to industry professionals in different sectors that are critical to the economy. And again, it means something very different to school administrators who look at it as a way of boosting student engagement and increasing school enrollment. And this is particularly true of private or international schools, which are not publicly funded. STEM also means something different to K-12 educators who are really looking at STEM as an educational framework which they can use to improve their own teaching and learning practices. And it means something very different to corporations. And with corporations, a lot of them are looking at it as a way of making lots of money. So we come to this notion, or a major problem within STEM education, which is the monopolization of STEM education, which is creating an unsustainable financial model that, if left unchecked, could cause a massive course correction that could seriously impact the nature of STEM education for years to come. Now, you might think that I'm going to say that corporations are evil, or you might already feel that way after seeing your generous budgets eroded by expensive educational products. But that is not the point that I'm trying to make. These corporate entities only responded to a need within education, a need that we ourselves made. And this is in part because teachers were asked to do something without being given the proper resources, support, and guidance. So the problems we face today were created collectively by society at large. But regardless of how we got to where we are today, there are problems in STEM that need to get addressed. So let's look at how we can solve these problems together. So let's start by developing our understanding of STEM education. Now, it's widely accepted that the acronym STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. Now, I don't think anyone in the audience would argue with that analysis. It seems that everyone that I talk to knows what STEM is. But in reality, nobody seems to understand what STEM is based on how much confusion and uncertainty there is around STEM and all of its derivatives. So let me delve into this a bit more for the educators in the audience. because I think most people are aware of Bloom's taxonomy. But for those of you who don't, Bloom's taxonomy is a classification of the different levels of thinking or cognition, where knowledge is at the bottom, and as we develop our understandings, we can start applying what we know and eventually start synthesizing and evaluating the results of our own thought process. And I think this is an important thing for us to stop and think about. Everybody has knowledge of what STEM is, but very few people have a deeper understanding of the true nature of STEM or what it should be. And we as educators know that there's a big difference between knowledge and understanding. Therefore, what we need to accomplish today is to move beyond a rudimentary knowledge of what STEM is and challenge our own assumptions. We need to determine what STEM education should be and what it should constitute. But before we do that, let's look at some of the criticisms that have been made of the STEM education framework. First, I'd like to direct you some comments that were made by Vince Bertman, who indicated that critical thinking is pinnacle to the successful development of a STEM program. However, other educational influencers, such as Georgette Yackman, didn't think that this was enough. And this led to her proposal of a derivative to STEM, which she called STEAM. And I'm sure that we're all well aware of this secondary educational movement. Meanwhile, Roos believes that we should promote a new structure which includes the arts and humanities. Roos states that it's only through the humanities that we will increasingly recognize and build on what we as humans uniquely are. It's through STEM plus MA progress that we'll have the chance to become practically wise. Furthermore, Fung goes on to criticize the superficial nature of STEM projects, indicating that STEM education is only concerned about the project itself while ignoring the concern for the person. And this one idea, or this criticism, really explains why China has adopted its own interpretation of STEM, which they refer to as STEM plus Sijijiaoyu, which essentially means STEM plus moral education, which is centered around the development of a person and their role in society. And even the World Economic Forum has called for a reform in STEM education, indicating that we should also expand the scope of STEM education to ensure that students learn to evaluate and respond to the social, economic, and political consequences of their work. Now, all of these examples illustrate some very critical views of STEM from some of the most reputable leaders in their respective fields. And all of this paints a pretty grim outlook for STEM education. You might think, based on what I've presented here so far, that there is no future in STEM. But I don't believe that. Now, while these criticisms are valid, they didn't solve the problem. Instead, what has happened is numerous STEM derivatives were created to solve a problem without understanding what caused the problem in the first place. And this has created an incredibly confusing landscape for educators and administrators alike, as there's no longer any common perception or language of what STEM is anymore. So let's take a look at some of these acronyms. So we have STEM, and we also have STEAM, which adds creativity through the arts, and I think everybody already knows these two acronyms. But we also have STEMs, which recognizes the importance of social sciences by adding the S at the end of the acronym. We have STEMA, which adds managerial arts, and this framework was created as a derivative and was first proposed by Harvard University. We have STEAM, which recognizes the importance of developing English literacy to help international students prepare themselves for an increasingly global marketplace. Now, as Tran indicates, countries with high English proficiency are more innovative as they have access to a wider breadth of current research materials from a global community. So this idea of including ESL curriculum into the STEM framework is actually quite important to help students in non-English speaking countries develop the skills needed to access a wider range of research materials, which will help them become more innovative. And this leads us to another derivative known as STREAM, which adds reading or research. And finally, we have STEM with a double M, which was created by Dr. Steve Meyer and Reverend John Gretz, who added the values of Christian missionary to the mandate of STEM education. And this ties in well with the idea that the World Economic Forum had, but from a slightly religious standpoint. And this also corresponds to the idea that the Chinese have with STEM plus 四肢教育, or moral education. Now, I would argue that all of these criticisms of STEM are not actually directed at the educational pedagogy of STEM itself, but actually address evident shortcomings or failings of poorly designed projects or curricula. Let me summarize everything here for a moment. All of these comments indicate a lack of creativity, a lack of meaningful connections with the human or social aspects of what we do or why we do it, and that STEM places too much emphasis on the act of doing instead of reaching the desired learning outcomes. But if we take a look at any of the careers in STEM, which we'll do in just a moment, you'll see that all of these shortcomings are actually critical aspects of what these professionals do on a daily basis. And for that reason, I believe that all of these criticisms of STEM education are invalid. Because essentially, all of these criticisms address shortcoming in the development of STEM projects or curricula which are either inadequate, inappropriate, or completely misrepresent the true nature of STEM. And that's why I've chosen to continue using the word STEM education instead of STEAM or any other derivative which may be more trendy at the moment. Because at the end of the day, the development of these derivatives has only served to further complicate matters while adding uncertainty and confusion to our understanding of STEM education. And this has distracted us from solving the problem at hand, which is understanding the true nature of STEM education and ensuring that what we're doing in the classroom, such as designing projects and curricula, actually support the desired learning outcomes. So let's really start thinking about what STEM is and really develop upon our conceptual paradigm of STEM. Because with all the confusion surrounding STEM education, we may not actually have a deep enough understanding, and this is needed for us to be able to properly define the true nature of STEM education, but more importantly, for us to be able to use that definition to assess our own teaching practices. So I really like this definition of STEM education as it's very true to the initial definition of STEM education that was introduced in 2001. So let's read through this definition together. STEM education is an interdisciplinary approach to learning where rigorous academic concepts are coupled with real-world lessons as students apply science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in contexts that make connections between school, community, work, and the global enterprise, enabling the development of STEM literacies and with the ability to compete in the new economy. Wow. This definition is very verbose, and it's really hard to unpack because it's so dense. So I'm going to highlight a few key words here. Interdisciplinary approach, rigorous academic concepts, real-world lessons, apply science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in context to compete in the new economy. Now, as I've already mentioned, STEM is actually linked to economic goals and national sovereignty. And we can't really forget about this connection because this is really the main driving force at the government level for STEM. But let's try simplifying this definition. Let's try coming up with something that the average person could comprehend. STEM solves real-world problems using science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So this is really the simplest definition that I can make to define STEM, and I've never had anyone really dispute or object to this definition. Now, as I mentioned earlier, paradigms establish boundaries. These boundaries shape our perceptions. Now, conceptual paradigms are not inherently bad, unless they limit our ability to see the obvious. And that's what we need to do right now. Currently, our paradigm, which I represented by a red box, is incredibly small. And this is really going to limit our understanding of STEM. So we need to add more depth if this is our working paradigm. So let's expand these boundaries. That way we can add more depth to our understanding of STEM education. So let's expand the boundaries of what we know so that we can add more depth. So let's expand the boundaries of what we know so that we can add more depth to our understanding of STEM to develop a deeper understanding of what STEM education should look like. So if our aim is to solve real-world problems, then the problem that we explore should be authentic. By extension, so should our solutions to that problem. And finally, the approach should also be cross-curricular. So let's take a look at some careers in STEM. We have the fields of architecture, biology, computing, engineering, the medical sciences, and horticulture, just to name a few. Now, I should also indicate that although there are thousands of careers in STEM, I'm only able to showcase a select few. Now, at first glance, these fields all look completely different, and you might say that there's not a common thread that links them all together. And it never even crosses the minds of most people to even look for a common link between a number of unrelated careers. But this is actually critical if we need to develop a deeper understanding of what STEM should be. Now, if the relationship is not evident to you, don't worry. It's not something that's naturally intuitive. But let me show you Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, you might not see the connection yet, but let me start with architecture. Simply put, an architect designs buildings, but if we delve a bit deeper, we can see that they create a wide array of structures. These structures include homes, schools, and hospitals. But no matter how simplistic or extravagant these structures are, they all provide us with shelter, which is one of our most fundamental human needs. And these needs are not isolated needs. Everyone in society needs access to shelter, education, and healthcare, places to connect. So architects serve societal needs. Next, the various fields of biology. And this one I think is very germane to our society right now. With the outbreak of COVID-19, researchers and biochemists alike have been sequencing viral mutations, creating vaccines and therapeutic drugs. Meanwhile, biomedical engineers are creating ventilators and other protective equipment to end the pandemic. Therefore, individuals in these fields are solving real-world problems that address the needs of society. And what about the field of computing? While some programmers do make things like games, many are engaged in the development and maintenance of programs that keep our societies running. Programmers create the traffic control systems that change the lights at intersections, the power management system that controls the national grid, and even the software that controls that life support system at the hospital. Moreover, hardware engineers develop new and innovative solutions that make all of these things possible. So again, these professionals are solving real-world problems that address the needs of society. Now, I think at this point, engineering and medical sciences would be self-explanatory, as these professions help to create and maintain a healthy society. So I'm going to jump to the last one, which is horticulture. So Yuan Longping is well known as the man who ended hunger. His hybrid rice strain saved millions of lives during the Great Famine and is now feeding nearly 1/5 of the world's population with less than 9% of the world's total landmass. And this is a prime example of what experts in various STEM fields do for a living. They solve real-world problems that address legitimate needs in our society. And I think that's another important qualifier that we need to add to our definition of STEM education. Careers in STEM address real needs in society and not individual wants or desires. So I'd like you to look at these two photographs for a moment and decide if both of these would represent a career in STEM. Think about it for a moment. After all, both of these individuals are working in the field of horticulture. Now, what evidence can you provide to support your argument? Now, I'm assuming everyone said that the farmer did not represent a career in STEM just by looking at the photo. But when I put these photos side by side, it's not so clear anymore. Why is one of these a career in STEM and the other isn't? And these kind of murky situations that really impact our understanding of STEM education when we don't have a conceptual paradigm that's deep enough to evaluate the true nature of STEM education. Now, the farmer on the right is helping to serve a real need in society. They use a vast array of agricultural technologies to do their jobs, apply different chemical or organic methods to improve crop yields, and they design irrigation systems. So wouldn't this be a career in STEM? After all, it meets so many of our criteria that we've come up for defining STEM. So let's take a look at both of them again. Yuan Lomping was an innovator who led change. He didn't grow all the rice that ended the famine. Instead, he created a new strain of rice which others could grow. The farmer, on the other hand, represents either skilled or unskilled labor. They're not leading change or innovation. And this is a key distinction that we need to make. STEM is about leading innovation and not about supporting the development of a general labor market. So what about any of these professional careers? Many people generally associate STEM with hands-on learning and skill development. So skilled or professional looking jobs are often considered to be a career in STEM. And this can often influence our choice as educators when we try planning our curriculum and making classroom activities. So let's take the chef for instance. Is this STEM, and what evidence do you have to support that argument? Well, we all need to eat, but as we saw with the example of the farmer, a chef is catering to individual wants or desires, not a legitimate need that addresses a societal issue. And for this reason alone, being a chef is not a career in STEM. Next, the sales clerk. And this could be selling insurance or any number of luxury items such as designer clothes or to a sports car. But again, these professionals are catering to individual desires and not societal needs. But what about the contractor? They're dealing with structural engineering, electrical systems, plumbing, the works. So if architecture and civil engineering are considered careers in STEM, should the contractor be considered as well? Well, while the contractor has a working knowledge of engineering, they represent the skilled labor force that execute the vision of the architects and the engineers. They're not the ones innovating, but are the ones making it happen. So again, we see this idea of the separation between innovation and skilled or unskilled labor, which needs to factor into our understanding of the true nature of STEM. So at this point, we should have a very clear definition of STEM, which is easy enough for anyone to understand. And it should have enough depth to really critically analyze and evaluate our educational practices. So let's quickly review what we've covered so far. STEM solves real-world problems using science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and should explore authentic problems by developing authentic solutions, using a cross-curricular approach while addressing legitimate needs in society, and should lead innovation through creative problem solving. But I should also emphasize that although numerous hands-on skills are learned in STEM, the focus of STEM education is not about developing skills for a general labor market, but about leading innovation. So if we go back and review all of the criticisms that have been made of STEM, we can actually see that all of the arguments are invalid based on our current framework. So let's quickly review each of them one at a time. STEM lacks creativity. STEM omits the humanities. STEM lacks management skills. STEM only focuses on the project itself. And STEM does not respond to the social or economic consequences. As we've seen, STEM is all about creative problem solving and often requires us to look at problems from a different perspective. So STEM does involve creativity and critical thinking. STEM is also centered around the humanities, and we can see that by the actions of industries who focus on solving real-world problems that are centered around societal needs. And our curriculum design in STEM should also mimic this reality as well. The fact that STEM lacks management skills is also a misnomer, as STEM is all about leading innovation, and this requires students to learn about project management, collaboration, and communication skills. So we see that STEM should cover all of these skill sets if it's being done properly. The fact that there's a growing number of people saying that STEM only focuses on the project itself is a concerning trend. And part of this is because of the number of do-it-yourself kits which are being sold under the guise of STEM education. Now, there's nothing wrong with do-it-yourself kits or the companies that sell them, but these do-it-yourself kits do not uphold the ideology of STEM education. However, the use of these kits is growing in STEM education, And this is being driven by the amount of confusion surrounding STEM education and a lack of support being given to educators who have been thrown into a program without any training. And finally, that STEM does not consider the social impacts of innovation. Again, this is completely inaccurate. Look at the development of hybrid rice strains by Yuan Longping, or the study of renewable energy. Look at the development of all the technologies that we use every day which improve our lives. And then think about how all of these innovations positively impact the social and economic well-being of our society. And that's really why I've decided to continue using the acronym STEM rather than adopting one of the acronyms that might be more trendy in the marketplace, because there's nothing wrong with STEM in its purest form. And that brings us to big idea number 3. At this point, I'd like to provide you with some classroom examples to apply our current understanding of STEM education. Now, the goal here is to review a number of STEM projects, evaluate them based on grade level expectations, and then look at ways to ensure that we're achieving the highest quality of teaching and learning in our classrooms. So here's a bunch of project examples from grade 11 program that I worked with a few years ago. Now you might say that these projects are not great, and I would completely agree with you. Now, if our goal is to create a rigorous academic program that will foster innovation in key economic sectors, and this is what we're doing in a grade 11 program, then we have a problem. And the school also thought so as well. Now, I started going through all of these class projects, and I did see some potential in one of them. So I'm going to take a look at this drone project in more detail. So we redesigned this project together, but this approach of using the 3D doodle pen in grade 11, that had to go. Now, with the original project, there was no math, there was no science, and there was no real use of technology either. Everything was just focused on the act of making a drone. It was completely reactive in nature, where STEM should apply the engineering and design process, which is a well-planned and methodical approach to design. So what we ended up creating was this. So you can see in this photo here that students started using specialized equipment such as calipers to take precise measurements. They then went on to make a rough draft of his design using a pencil and paper before reviewing it, critiquing it, and then revising it. Finally, students then digitized their designs using a CAD program so that they could print their designs using a 3D printer. Now you might say that this looks great, but as I mentioned before, STEM should solve real-world problems. So you might be asking me, how does this drone problem address a legitimate need in our society? Well, not that long ago, we had a major flood in Henan province in China, and they had a really interesting solution that they had been developing for a number of years prior to this natural disaster, and they were able to deploy this new technology for the first time. It was an automated drone that could restore 5G cell service for a 50 square kilometer area for up to 5 hours. And this one drone was able to help search and rescue crews find, locate, and save thousands of people in the aftermath of the flood. So this idea of drone development actually solves real-world problems. So although the initial project design that used a 3D doodle pen did not really involve any critical thinking and was poorly executed, there was value in the idea. The teacher just needed help to redefine that idea and to develop a project that was more meaningful. So after redesigning the project, students were shown how to properly apply the engineering and design process in an authentic way, while using specialized equipment such as calipers to take precise measurements, which they would then use to create their drones. They created designs on paper, analyzed their ideas with their peers in a formal critique process, made revisions to their designs, and then digitized those designs using a CAD program on the computer. And they did this so that they could use technologies such as 3D printers in an authentic way to support the desired learning outcomes. And finally, they created a high-quality product that upholds the ideals of STEM education. Now here's a quick video of one of the student projects. While it did use a pre-made circuit, the drone itself was created by the student. Now, what about this STEM project here? This was a project that was used to promote the school's STEM education program. Now, what grade level do you think this project is for? What about now? This was actually a grade 12 honors chemistry project where the students were learning about creating water-resistant paints. Now, you might be thinking, just as I am right now, that this activity isn't appropriate for that grade level. But the school was proud of the results because they thought that this was a good example of STEM because the students were engaged in hands-on projects. Now, here are some more images from that post. And you can see that these grade 12 students are in a well-equipped chemistry lab creating paints using craft glue and ground up colored chalk. But we're probably asking ourselves, where's the real chemistry? This was supposed to be a lesson about making colored paints. And again, this comes down to the idea of throwing teachers into STEM without the necessary training or support. After all, designing authentic STEM lessons is really difficult, especially if teachers have never worked in industry before. Now, I should state that this teacher was an absolute amazing chemistry teacher when it came to teaching theoretical concepts, but they had a limited understanding of how science would be applied to solve real-world problems in industry. Now, there's so many ways that we could have made this project more appropriate for grade 12 students. So here I have some examples of what we could have done instead. Here, on the left, I have reference to how we could look at different chemical compounds that would allow for a thermochromatic effect to be explored. That is, when the color of something changes due to the temperature as a result of a reversible chemical reaction. Next, on the right, I have examples of how you can create ferric oxide to create color pigments. Now, for reference, ferric oxide and titanium dioxide are actually key components in the manufacturing of makeup products such as blush. So we already have a few options that we could use to improve this one project. But let's take this a bit further. Now that we have some pigments, we can then explore different chemical methods to convert this pigment into a usable paint. First, we could look at how to use different chemical solutions to create a binding agent and a chemical solvent. Second, we could look at our past to see how some of our greatest minds have created masterpieces such as the Sistine Chapel. At this time, paints were made using pigments such as ferric oxide and lapis lazuli, which were ground up into fine powders. These pigments were then mixed with egg whites to create a molecularly stable, organic compound that could last for centuries. And in all honesty, these methods were actually superior to our current manufacturing processes in many ways. So this project could easily be redesigned in a way that would make it much more meaningful. So what about this project? Again, it's another social media post, this time for a grade 12 calculus project. Now, the post indicated that the students were exploring the velocity of a marble using calculus, but realistically the math and the project are somewhat disassociated from one another. You don't really need to do the math to do the project, and you don't need to do the project to do the math. So these two aspects of the project are loosely correlated. So is this STEM? And I've also seen roller coaster projects used throughout a number of different year groups. I myself did it in grade 4 during summer camp. And here we have an example of that project being done by a grade 1 class as well. So here we have evidence of the same project being done at very different age levels, and this raises some serious questions. Are we actually developing projects that are appropriate? And this disconnect between learning outcomes and project design related to STEM education is causing a lot of problems. Now here we have a website promoting this activity, and I'm not disputing the quality of the website, the resource, or the validity of the project. But what I want to draw your attention to is something up here in the corner. If we look at this, it indicates arts and crafts, hands-on fun, and that's how this project is being described. But when we look at the driving forces which led to the creation of STEM, it was really to meet the needs of critical sectors in the economy. STEM was created to ensure continued economic prosperity of the nation, and this plays a pivotal role in protecting our national sovereignty. It was never to create hands-on activities so that students could have fun in class. So how did we get here? How did STEM deviate so far from its initial mission? And when we look at some of these books here, such as STEAM Creations and Book Inspired STEAM Activities for Kids, again, I'm not going to criticize the book or the author, but I do want you to look at these examples of what people are starting to call STEAM education. And if you look here, it says craft brain. These are all arts and crafts. Now, STEAM was supposed to fix the problems that we talked about earlier in this presentation. However, these examples do not address the issue of student proficiency in critical sectors to the economy, while also not helping students to understand how to solve real-world problems using authentic cross-curricular approaches, while also only focusing on the project itself, while failing to address the human, social, or economic impacts that are related to the project. And when we look at this list of shortcomings, they represent all of the issues that were made of the original STEM education framework. So it's very clear that STEAM didn't solve the problem. It actually made it worse. So how did we get here? How did we get to the point of rigorous academic programs becoming nothing more than arts and crafts throughout all grade levels? So to understand how we got here, we need to understand a number of cause and effect relationships that are happening within our society. We need to understand our own history. So as I said, the space race of the 1950s through 60s acted as a catalyst that galvanized all aspects of our society, specifically in America. And it ushered in an era of unprecedented collaboration between government, industry, and the educational sector. And this led to the development of high-quality VTE programs in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. However, by the late 90s, many of the educators that were part of this golden age of collaboration were approaching retirement, and this in turn led to the stagnation of these programs. Moreover, by the year 2000, it was evident that the economy was lagging in key sectors as well. Therefore, STEM was introduced to address the issues of student proficiency in these key areas. However, a critical issue was overlooked. The root causes of these problems were never identified. We were quick to determine that students' proficiency was trailing in key sectors in the economy, but we never stopped to ask why this was happening. So let me explain. The late 1990s onwards saw a lot of experienced technology teachers leave the profession due to old age and retirement. Meanwhile, the introduction of STEM education in 2001 created huge demand for qualified teachers, and this shortage was only exacerbated by the effect of numerous teachers simultaneously leaving the profession. Moreover, while demand for teachers outpaced supply, appropriate actions were not taken to address the issue of teacher shortages in these key sectors. As a result, new teachers were often asked to teach STEM with little support, training, or guidance. And as we saw, we didn't have And as we see, we didn't actually achieve our initial goals with STEM education based on the findings that were published in the reports Rising Above the Gathering Storm. And this situation only got worse, and it led to the development of a number of STEM derivatives. However, as we start to see, these derivatives such as STEAM didn't address the root cause of the problems, and in reality, they only served to further complicate matters and make things worse. So STEM was introduced to address a massive issue in our society. And we see this burden being placed on teachers to solve massive issues in our society. And there are huge expectations from both government and industry. However, any of the teachers in the audience will know all too well, teachers are seldomly given the support or guidance that they need to fulfill these kinds of requests. Moreover, unlike what we saw happen in the 1950s and 60s, our current situation doesn't have that galvanizing catalyst to help foster collaboration between these sectors, government, industry, and education. As a result, anything that involved hands-on approaches to teaching and learning started getting branded as STEM education, as many teachers developed a simplistic or superficial understanding of STEM based on the most evident thing that they could see. That is, STEM involves hands-on projects and activities. Furthermore, as a result of all the confusion surrounding the development of STEM education, corporations started capitalizing on the business opportunities in the educational sector. While some companies created new educational resources, other companies simply rebranded existing products to capitalize on a market that was ripe for the taking. And that brings me to my next topic: looking beyond the fads. Now, the advent of STEM education saw thousands of products come to market which enabled teachers to easily introduce hands-on learning in the classroom. However, many of these products solely focused on the act of making and often failed to address the key learning outcomes. And as we saw earlier, this was a large contributing factor that led to many of the criticisms against STEM education in the first place. So I want to talk about this idea of fads versus enduring knowledge, or more specifically, looking at developing sustainable curriculums that can withstand the test of time. Here I have a job advert for a school which is showcasing one of their STEM projects, a racetrack for CO2 racers, and this is a project that I personally really like. It's also one of the best-selling STEM projects from a company such as Hygienius and Pittsco. Now, while some of these products have only been around for a couple of years, this one product has been sold in the US for close to 70 years now, well before the existence of STEM was ever created. For example, here's the Pittsco Guide to Education from the 1990s that I used as a student when I studied technology. But CO2 racers were popular way before then. These final examples, you can see some of the do-it-yourself kits from the mid-1950s. These kits were popular activities as they helped kids get interested in aerodynamics and propulsion during the US-Soviet space race. Now, although this was a little bit before my time, my father's generation would build rocket-propelled race cars and race them in tournaments, some of which were held at semi-national levels. Now, we can see the influence of this idea of rocket-propelled vehicles as a major driving force in our society to this day. From the development of the fastest land-based vehicle, which essentially was a rocket on wheels, to our modern-day maglev train technologies. All of these advancements came from the study of propulsion and aerodynamics. Now, the idea of rocket propulsion and aerodynamics, which are all covered in the design of a CO2 racer, is an ideal that can transcend time. And although some of the methods and approaches that we may take will vary, the core learning objectives, that is the curriculum at the heart of the project, that has remained the same. And I think that's an important thing to consider when developing sustainable STEM programs. We need to look at the learning outcomes and not be distracted by new fads or technology. So with that in mind, I want to show you some examples of what our technology programs looked like in the 1990s just to illustrate this point. Here we have examples of this project being done back in 1993. Again, this is before STEM even existed, but you can really see the cross-curricular nature of these programs had back then. Not only did the students design, build, and test their racers, they also dealt with the logistics of setting up tournaments, broadcasting, and providing live commentary of the event. Now fast forward 30 years. I wanted to start a broadcasting program at my school, so I pulled out all of my old equipment from storage. Now, many of these cameras were purchased when I started my first company back in 2002, so we were not using state-of-the-art equipment. However, all of the schools that attended this championship tournament were amazed at how sophisticated our setup was. Everyone said that they'd never seen anything like it before, and that really shocked me. Think about it. How did we digress so far? And why is it that I'm constantly looking to our past to find inspiration for our future, particularly in the fields of science and technology? So again, I want to take you back to a class project from the 1990s. This was an amazing aviation project that my teacher, John Perkins, designed in collaboration with an aerospace engineer. Now, we spent the entire term learning the math, science of aviation, manufacturing techniques, electronics, and control systems. And at the end of the day, we built a scale model, which was still quite big, that we flew out of the local airport. And this is a great example of what an interdisciplinary approach to real-world lessons which offers rigorous academic concepts, would look like. And that's what I think the government was looking for when Judith Ramley introduced the term STEM in 2001. So when I started designing aviation projects for STEM programs here in China, I did exactly what John did 30 years ago. I reached out to industry professionals and started working with an aerospace engineer from the Nanjing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And this really helped me as a teacher to design scaffolded projects that would make introducing aviation into high school programs in China a viable reality. But we do not see this kind of collaboration happening anymore between government, industry professionals, and teachers. And this has really been to the detriment of STEM education. Now, I've also mentioned that STEM should be addressing needs, not wants, while solving real-world problems. So you might be thinking, how does the study of aviation address real-world problems? Well, recently I came across this news story on CNN which illustrates this idea perfectly. Johan wanted to know if his life choices were having a positive effect on addressing climate change, so he contacted CNN for help. Now, Johan has a very healthy lifestyle. He eats mostly vegetables, he rides his bike everywhere, and has installed solar panels on his roof. Now, based on all of these factors, his carbon footprint is about 40% less than the average American. However, there's one choice that negates all of his other choices. Every year, Johan returns to the Netherlands to visit his family. As we can see in this example, all of the choices that he as an individual can make are dwarfed in comparison by the one thing that's out of his control: the emissions from commercial aviation. And so this idea of researching aerodynamics has and will continue to be an important aspect for years to come. And that leads me to my next example. While over-the-counter do-it-yourself kits would provide educators with easy, ready-made projects that could be implemented with little to no preparation, these kits tend to offer very little towards achieving the desired learning outcomes of established curriculums. However, Rocketry has so many wonderful grade-level extensions for senior school students. Drawing inspiration from my experience from the late 1990s, I can speak to the scientific value model rockets can have. Take this for example. Here's a balanced chemical equation for a combustion-based reaction that can be used to create a stable solid fuel rocket engine. Now, if you're not familiar with chemistry, let me explain what's happening here. First, we have potassium nitrate or fertilizer, and this is mixed with regular table sugar. As long as the chemical mixture does not come in contact with a flame, it's relatively stable. However, it is capable of creating a powerful combustion-based chemical reaction that will create a large amount of thrust. This reaction will create the formation of an inorganic compound, carbon dioxide, and water. Now, as an instructor, I wouldn't give my students the balanced chemical equation. Instead, I would start by reviewing how to balance a chemical equation and then have them balance this equation on their own before checking their work and moving on. Then, in order to create the most effective rocket fuel, students would need to determine the molar mass of each compound so that they can determine the correct ratio. With all of the math done, they would then be ready to move on to creating their own rocket fuel. Now, as it stands, this project would have them apply chemistry in an authentic way. However, it still wouldn't have the students apply the scientific method. And I have a perfect way of doing that. What would happen if we added aluminum to the mix? Would it improve your rocket's performance? And what evidence could you use to support your claim? In this case, students would need to formulate a hypothesis that they could then go on and test. Now, in theory, adding something that's not necessary to balance the chemical equation is bad. However, adding aluminum to rocket fuel is an exception to that rule. Let me tell you more about this phenomenon. In the early 1950s, Kenneth Rumble and Charles Henderson conducted a series of experiments where they added aluminum to conventional rocket fuels. The results of their experiments indicated a dramatic increase in the exit velocity of combustion gases. So much so that it brought solid rocket fuels into similar performance levels as liquid fuels such as kerosene and liquid oxygen. Due to their research into chemical propulsion methods, the US Navy was able to significantly increase the range of ballistic missiles and orbital rockets. Now, because this was a bit of a trick scenario, almost every student's hypothesis will be disproven. However, this will give them a great opportunity to conduct some internet research to look for answers. And students should be able to find the answers to this question as the initial research has been declassified and can easily be found on the internet. But what about testing such a hypothesis? Well, in the 1990s, we had to use analog test equipment like what I'm showing here. However, we can now use digital force meters, which open up a world of possibilities. We can now easily record and export precise data from our experiments directly to the computer, which is great for collecting data. So it's actually even easier to do this kind of experiment now than it was 30 years ago. Now you can see what a simple setup for testing homemade rocket engines would look like in this photo. And finally, if your school has a metal shop, which mine did back in the 1990s, you can also manufacture your own rocket engines using a small metal lathe. Now, as you can see from this example, when you develop a fully cross-curricular approach to teaching and learning, which is what should be happening in STEM, you'll find that projects last longer, which lowers the hourly cost of instruction, and they go much deeper into the core curriculum. And that type of in-depth and insightful exploration, that's what's going to make students more competitive in a global economy. Not all these superficial do-it-yourself projects that don't investigate how or why something works. Now, as I mentioned before, without a galvanizing force to bring governments, industry, and education together, teachers were asked to do the impossible. And that's where corporations came to the rescue. Teachers were crying out for support, resources, and materials, and companies were all too happy to start supplying products to fill this need. But this also gave them an opportunity to start directing the narrative as well, which would give them the power to hijack and monopolize what was unfolding in the educational sector. Now, Lego is a great example of this, and don't get me wrong, it's one of my favorite companies. Now, this Lego Dactyl controller is actually a product that Lego released back in the 1990s before STEM even existed. Now, you may be interested to know that the original Lego robotics kits were not designed for children. Lego robotics was actually designed for engineering students at MIT so that they could rapid prototype ideas in the lab. And the first time I used one of these Lego Dactyl controllers was in the R&D lab at Queen's University. Now, fast forward to present day, we now have things like this Lego Spike Kit being sold to schools in droves to support programming and robotics programs in the lower years. Now, this product is great because it has a low point of entry in the sense that you can play with it just like a toy. But there's so much potential in what you could actually do with it. And this low point of entry and gamification of programming has become the cornerstone of a lot of STEM programs, especially as STEM pushes further and further into younger year groups. Now, while programming is important, and it is one of the areas that is critical to our global economy, it has become the dominant focus of most programs at the expense of other areas that are critical to the economy as well. Now, Lego did a great job of simplifying coding while also providing tactile learning resources that would make abstract concepts more accessible to students at a young age. And as a result, the idea that students could learn logic and abstraction from a very young age took hold in international education. For example, England went on to become the first country in the European Union to mandate computer science classes for all children between the ages of 5 and 16. And if you read through the national curriculum, you'd probably think that the UK is the most technologically advanced nation on earth based on what's indicated here. Now, for anyone who's unfamiliar with the British education system, Key Stage 1 and 2 is equivalent to grades 1 and 2 in the United States. Now, with that in mind, this document goes on to state the following: high quality computing education, information and computation, abstraction, logic, and algorithms, analyze computational terms. So we're indicating that children that are only 5 to 7 years old should be able to learn concepts such as abstraction and logic, and computational algorithms. That's pretty impressive because my year 1 university program didn't even go into these topics. So there's a real disconnect here. And another thing we need to consider is that teachers in primary are generalists who teach all subject areas. So you have this notion of asking a teacher with limited to no experience in programming to teach advanced concepts in programming which is very unrealistic. Now, England is not alone, and in 2016, Finland also introduced programming into their national curriculum. However, Finland did identify the following in their initial action plan. Due to the varied skill levels of Finnish teachers in their ability to teach the basics, the Finnish Ministry of Education will be relying on private sector corporations in the initial stages. But this is really concerning to me. The Ministry of Education is concerned with teachers' ability to teach the basics. Now, remember that story that I told you at the start of my presentation? An industry leader did not want to hire employees that had been educated in their respective fields? Well, this is because that they knew that the prospective employees would have had a flawed perceptual paradigm that would likely be detrimental to their success in the field. So, when teachers are asked to teach concepts when they lack the ability to teach the basics, it's only logical that students would go on to develop a flawed perceptual paradigm of what they're learning. And that really ties into that story I told you at the beginning of this presentation. Now, the appropriate age for teaching programming is widely disputed, so I'm not likely going to win that argument. But one theory that isn't contested in education is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. In Key Stage 1 and 2, we often use a concept called physical, pictorial, abstract, sometimes also referred to as concrete, pictorial, abstract. But I have an example to illustrate the concept if you're unfamiliar with it. At this stage, students are still developing their perceptual understanding of the world around them. They may be creative and imaginative, but imagination is not the same thing as abstract thought. But the key thing to keep in mind here is that at this age, students are developing some level of abstraction as they move from physical to abstract representations in things such as number systems. But this is very different than what abstraction means in computer science and programming. Moreover, in grade 2 through 5, students are still using tactile math blocks like what you see here. These are the ones, tens, hundreds, and thousand blocks. While smaller values are used at lower grade levels, the math example that I provided here is more typical of a grade 5 curriculum. But you can see that students still wouldn't have learned concepts such as order of operations, algebra, Boolean operations, and logic, which are all key precursors to learning computer science if we're actually going to look at concepts such as abstraction, logic, and computational algorithms. And this wouldn't start until stage 4 in the child's teenage years. So the only way that we can push such advanced concepts into such a young age group is to continually simplify and gamify a complex idea to the point of completely misrepresenting the true nature that the concept in the first place. Now, to illustrate the naivety of this decision, I turn to this UK article that was published by eFinancial Careers, How Computer Programming Became the Worst Choice of Career. But if one news article is not enough to illustrate a possible disconnect with our perceptions versus reality in education, let's look at another key economic indicator. Here's a list of all the Fortune 500 companies in England. Now, despite being the first to introduce a national curriculum that requires students to learn computer science and programming, we don't see a single company in artificial intelligence, hardware or computer engineering, or software development. And when we look at critical skill shortages in the United Kingdom, we see that electrical, computer, and software engineering are all top of the list. And there's also a number of other key sectors listed here as well that I talked about when discussing the different careers in STEM at the beginning of my presentation. So let's look at how these critical skill shortages affect the economy. Well, as this report shows, the UK has serious skill shortages in sectors that are critical to the economy, such as engineering. And this has made the UK dependent on foreign expertise in technologies, specifically in telecommunication infrastructure and network engineering. And due to the current global situation, many MPs perceive that there's an imminent threat to England's national security. Whether or not such a threat really exists is another issue completely, but there's enough of a perception to urge government to end all contracts with leading telecom giant Huawei. But what does this decision mean for British customers? Well, They will be left paying for a multi-million-dollar network overhaul that will see the delay of 5G services nationwide. In layman's terms, they will pay more money to have an inferior service for a number of years while they catch up to the rest of the world. And this will have adverse effects on businesses as they have to try to compete using older and slower network technologies while paying more money to access these services in the first place. So as you can see, the failure to meet the needs of these critical sectors does have a direct effect on the economy, our national security, and sovereignty. So how is it that a country that was first to introduce a national computer science curriculum be lagging so far behind other countries that don't even offer computing? Well, remember that story I told you about my sister where Fortune 500 companies did not want to hire graduates that had formal educational training in their respective job sector because they often developed a flawed operational paradigm? Well, that's what we see here. In order to teach programming to all students, regardless of their aptitude or interest in program, companies that create interactive program platforms need to resort to simplification and gamification of programming skills, which has resulted in the true nature of programming being misrepresented to an entire generation of students. So I want to go back to this quote from the Finnish Ministry of Education. Due to the varied skill levels of Finnish teachers and their ability to teach the basics, the Finnish Ministry of Education will be relying on private sector corporations in the initial stages. They know that their teachers do not have the skills needed to teach programming, so they're going to rely on corporations to create ready-made solutions that would allow the average teacher to be able to teach programming without any prior knowledge. So let me show you what these solutions look like in practice. Here's a video that I was given by an experienced computer science teacher as they reviewed one of these online programming platforms. As you can see, they just clicked the insert button and code just magically populated the relevant areas. Now, to a teacher or administrator who knows nothing about programming, it would be easy to walk into a classroom and be impressed at how much programming is happening. But that's not the reality of what's actually happening. In all honesty, we have completely misrepresented the true nature of programming, and that would encourage the wrong students to pursue programming for all of the wrong reasons. What we've done is to create a flawed perceptual paradigm of what programming is, and that could be detrimental to the student's future success in the field of computer science. But let me support this further with some research. So here's a key takeaway from a research study that was done by the Rochester Institute of Technology. They indicated that teachers face several challenges when presenting the fundamental concepts of programming in the classroom. The research study also found that students who learned programming using a block-based environment had a higher probability of producing syntax errors in an authentic text-based programming environment. And as you can see by this chart, the discrepancy is staggering. And another study from Northwestern University had similar findings, indicating that students generally found block-based programming to be easier, but the students went on to identify issues of authenticity. Now, when thinking about the original mandates of STEM to create rigorous academic programs to compete in the new economy, the very notion of our instruction methods lacking authenticity seems questionable. Now, please don't get me wrong, programming is incredibly important, but it's also an incredibly difficult subject area to teach well. What I'm implying here is that programming really needs to be done by a professional who knows what they're talking about. It needs to be done at a point in time where students have the cognitive ability to properly comprehend abstract concepts such as logic and computation. And we also need to make sure that we're not misrepresenting the true nature of programming either. For instance, the gamification and simplification of programming makes it more accessible has created a seriously flawed perception of what programming is all about. So what happens when students don't take programming seriously and their programs are riddled with syntax errors, as we saw in those research studies? What happens when there's syntax errors in the programming that controls our traffic lights? Well, people could get into traffic accidents and die. What happens when there's syntax errors in our national power grid? Well, we could have rolling blackouts, which could result in people dying. And what happens if there's syntax errors in that life support system at the hospital? Well, I think I've made my point by now. So if it isn't STEM, then what is it? So let me take a look at these 3 projects for a moment, because all of these are considered to be STEM nowadays. Let's start with the first one for a moment. It's a science diorama. It does not solve any real-world problems, and it doesn't lead in innovation. While this project does blend art and science together, the art is peripheral and doesn't actually help to develop our understanding of the solar system. Furthermore, this project does not address a legitimate need, but a desire or want to make a fun, engaging project. Great, that's perfectly valid, but it's not STEM by definition. This is a prime example of project-based learning, which is an excellent approach to teaching and learning that teachers could incorporate into their classroom regardless of what subject they teach. Next is Lego, which I personally love, while also being somewhat critical of its overuse in schools. Now, if we consider Piaget theory of cognitive development, this kind of kinesthetic activity is excellent for the development of concrete operational skills between the ages of 7 and 11 years old. Again, this isn't STEM though. This represents play and learn, which again is a perfectly valid framework and is critical for this stage of cognitive development in children. And finally, the robot. Of course, we all think that this is STEM because the student made a robot. But did they really? They could have made anything here: a fairy princess, a superhero, or an animal friend. This is actually just arts and crafts. And that's one thing that is happening a lot now, is as schools try to make K-12 programs without really understanding the true nature of STEM. And this has resulted in a number of perfectly valid teaching pedagogies being swallowed up by the STEM craze. But this kind of misrepresentation of STEM promotes a flawed understanding that only contributes to us moving further and further away from the original objectives, which was to create a rigorous academic program that promoted real-life applications of science, technology, engineering, and math skills, which would prepare students for the new economy. And that brings me back to my example about coffee at the start of this presentation. People's perceptions are often very different from reality. Now, I'm sure everyone is well aware of this kind of meme related to expectations versus reality. But maybe I should swap out this corporate example to provide an educational example of this instead. Again, I'm going to come back to this notion that STEAM was created in response to national studies that were indicating that America was falling behind our other nations in critical sectors to the economy. While the VTE programs of the 1970s through 90s benefited from the collaboration between government, industry leaders, and educators alike, the STEM movement of the 21st century didn't have this galvanizing catalyst to drive educational reforms. And as we saw by the follow-up reports, America continued to fall further and further behind. But now, 20 years later, with the evolution of STEM into STEAM and the widespread adoption of these programs in most schools, what do the numbers look like? Unfortunately, things do not look good. Look at America, not even in the green anymore. The nation that was once a world leader, the country that invented STEM education, still falling even further and further behind. And why is that? Because teachers were never properly supported in the early days of STEM education. And this led to confusion and disarray with the development of and execution of STEM programs worldwide, and we can see the long-term results clearly. But what about Canada there? Top of the list of all English-speaking countries in the world. What are they doing that's different than other nations? Well, Canada is one of the few nations that has a vocational to teacher education program track, which allow industry professionals to become qualified teachers. But not only that, not only is the program track available, it's actually a requirement for teachers going in to teach any of the high-skilled technologies, such as electrical engineering, computer, and mechanical engineering. So teachers who teach these rigorous academic programs that are designed to prepare students for the new global economy are former industry professionals. And these professionals have invaluable experiences that they can bring to the education to help them design authentic, real-world lessons that apply science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in the appropriate context. And here we can see all of those key words we keep talking about from the original mission statement from the development of STEM education. So let me take a moment to talk about program management for all of the administrators and leaders in the audience. Now, remember when I said the reality of what people think they wanted and what they actually want are generally two very different things? And that is particularly true for administrators and parents in this regard. So let me illustrate this point. Here in China, parents want the best for their child. They want holistic education, and they don't want their child to go through the mass hysteria of an exam-based system such as the Chinese Gaokao. But what's the first thing that these parents do after pulling their child out of a rigorous exam-based system? They typically enroll their child in either IGCSE courses, which is just another exam-based system, or they force the child to take as many AP courses as possible, which again is an exam-based system. And these examples really illustrate how parents' perceptions of what they want and the reality of what they want for their child are two totally different things. They think they want a holistic approach to education, but in reality, they just swap one exam-based system for another, and they pay a lot of money for this, so they expect results. Now, the average cost of private education in China is now in excess of 20,000 US dollars a year, which is a lot of money. And in Shanghai, the average is actually over 40,000 a year. And this actually starts shedding some light on the recent policy changes in China to crack down on private education sectors for those of you who follow the news. But the key takeaway here is that there's a lot of money in private education, and parents want to get their money's worth. Now, because of the expectations of parents, which is phenomenally high, coupled with the cost of tuitions, which is outrageous, and the level of competition between schools being unprecedented, school administrators want programs that can sell. They typically want to see highly marketable programs that show inclusive activities where students are engaged in holistic, hands-on activities. And we saw that with some of these examples. We had inclusive hands-on activities being done, but as we saw, many of them were not holistic and they failed to meet appropriate learning outcomes. And that brings me to another key point. There's a difference between showing and doing. It's easy to show people that we're doing STEM education, but it's very hard to do it well. And that brings me to these two ideologies for STEM education that administrators are constantly grappling with. They think they want an inclusive program that are engaging and fun, but they also want to give the parents exactly what they want, which is a rigorous academic program that will improve test scores. And we find that these two ideas are often incompatible with each other, and that creates a phenomenon known as academic culture shock. Now, with culture shock, we always start with the honeymoon phase, and this is where schools start. There's a lot of excitement around launching a new program, and there's lots of money getting spent. But that's followed by the rejection phase, where schools are expecting to see a positive return on their investments, but are disappointed with the results that they're seeing. When their multi-million-dollar investments turn into this, a bunch of glorified art projects coupled with an unmarketable pile of junk. And this brings us to the regression phase, where school administrators grapple with the idea of what to do next. And one of two things will happen here. Ideally, all of the responsible parties will sit down, identify the problem, and develop a strategic action plan that takes into consideration what the school can feasibly do with its resources, and develop a plan that's aligned with the school's vision and objectives. Alternatively, emotions come into play, and we continue to make bad financial decisions as we try to continue to support the mistakes we've made in the past. At this point, two things can happen to our programs. If a strategic plan is developed, a program will often go on to become successful. However, if we get trapped by emotional attachment to bad investments which represent a number of sunk costs, then the program will only limp on, continue to drain financial resources, and eventually go on to fail. And this brings me to a conversation with a teacher who was very distraught about what was happening at their school. Now, they were hired as a STEM teacher to teach computer science, design technology, and makerspace. But the school had gone through such an emotional roller coaster that the principals never wanted to hear the word STEM uttered in their school again. And that kind of backlash against STEM education is starting to grow as more schools enter the rejection phase due to bad implementation plans. And this could have serious impacts on the future of STEM education if we don't start taking action to solve the problem. So, how does this situation come to pass? Well, school administrators often invest in equipment and facilities to create the need, rather than looking at developing a curriculum and making strategic purchases to support the desired learning outcomes of that curriculum. To aid them in this task, administrators often look at purchasing guides to help them get started. But this approach is very naive because such guides will not take into consideration limiting factors such as the amount of space, finances, number of students, or the expertise of the teachers who will eventually teach the programs. Moreover, most of these purchasing guides are published by the very companies that sell the equipment in the first place. These companies do not care about the internal development of curriculum at the school. They only care about selling as much product as they can. Next, teachers are brought in to teach a program and often complain that they don't have the appropriate materials to make the necessary connections to the curriculum. As a result, authentic projects become next to impossible to develop, and instruction resorts to the lowest common denominator, which is typically glorified arts and craft projects. And finally, this results in compromised program development and a growing level of frustration and hostilities between parents, teachers, and administrators. Now, misaligned equipment purchases in STEM. So let's take a look at one example of misaligned equipment purchases that can result from using easy start guides to STEM education. So in this example, the school spends thousands of dollars on equipment which they believe represents STEM education. In this example, the school bought a class set of Singer sewing machines which are very expensive, top-of-the-line equipment. Now, to make use of the equipment purchases, the school starts teaching skills for a labor market and not transferable skills for innovation. And this is because they naively think that the hands-on learning is the same as STEM education. But this kind of skill set is misaligned with what the parents expect for their child's future. As a result, the parents become displeased that their child is not being given the rigorous academic program that they paid for. Now, let me put the parents' concern into a suitable context for you. Now, the average wage for a seamstress is $12.94 an hour, which is just above the poverty line. And in developing countries, it's less than $2 a day. But private schools are charging $40,000 a year for tuition. Parents that are spending that kind of money on private education are expecting a rigorous academic program that will help their child get into the best university possible and for their child to go on to get a high-paying job. They're not going to want to invest thousands of dollars for their child to learn skills for a general labor market, which would result in their child getting a job that pays just enough to live above the poverty line. Now, there's nothing wrong with sewing lessons. I myself had a mandatory life skill class when I was in school in Japan. In this class, we learned how to drink tea properly with respect, manage our personal finances using the computer, how to cook basic meals, and yes, we also learned how to sew. But we learned how to sew a button on our shirts or repair a ripped seam in our pant leg, which cost almost nothing to do with a needle and thread, and it has real-world applications. But this wasn't by any means called STEM education. It was called life skills. And the skills we learned were not to prepare us to go into unskilled labor, but to help us learn practical skills that we would likely use in everyday life, regardless of what profession we all went into. The last point that I have time to make here is in regards to value-added service. Keep in mind that what might be considered a wise decision for one school may not be considered acceptable at another. And this is particularly true of public institutions which offer free education versus private institutions that come at a hefty price tag. Let me give you an example, as we saw with the Finnish Ministry of Education. They were concerned about teachers' ability to teach the basics. Now, if the Finnish government paid for an interactive programming subscription, which would be given to students in the public school for free of charge, then the school has provided value-added service to the parents. However, if a private school, which charges $40,000, does the exact same thing, the parents will probably be outraged because they could have just bought that subscription for way less than what they're paying for their child to go to that school. So the private school hasn't actually provided any value-added services to the parent. Now, throughout this presentation, I've spent a lot of time analyzing problems related to various STEM programs. I've also provided you with several examples of how to create rigorous academic connections that place science, technology, engineering, and mathematics into real-world lessons that provide authentic learning opportunities. However, due to time constraints, I've only been able to illustrate several possible scenarios of how to address evident shortcomings in the execution of various projects. Now, while accurately identifying the nature of the program is the most important step, and it's something that a lot of people don't actually do, it's still only the first step needed in fixing the problem. So if you found this webinar enlightening, you may want to consider downloading and watching any of the other presentations that are related to the development of high-quality STEM programs. All of these presentations are equally as informative as this one, and will provide you with evidence-based examples and project modeling that will help you design STEM programs that will prepare your students for the new global economy. These virtual webinars include lectures such as establishing a practical electrical engineering program without breaking the bank, developing a sustainable STEM program, how to create a cost-effective program that focuses on developing learning outcomes rather than dependency on technology, computer engineering, reimagining the computer science curriculum, and computational algorithms, a visual exploration for non-programmers. Now, before we conclude today's presentation, let's quickly look at a few takeaways that you can use to help improve your school's STEM program. Let's start with recommendations that would be implemented by the Ministry of Education. Number 1, continue reviewing foreign research on the development of STEM teaching pedagogies and philosophies while conducting internal research studies into the ongoing development of domestic STEM programs. 2, develop more teacher training programs for local teachers to address immediate teacher shortages. 3, create VTE or industry STEM teacher pathways to address interim teacher shortages. And this is something that we saw happening in Canada, as the PISA results show. They must be doing something right. 4, develop concurrent teacher training programs to address long-term demand for highly qualified teacher professionals. 5, encourage local STEM teachers to conduct and publish research into the ongoing development of the local development of STEM programs within their own country. Now, this is actually a requirement for Chinese teachers to write and publish research papers on education. And I think this is a really helpful strategy to ensure continued professional development of teachers, particularly in demanding sectors such as STEM education. 6, strategically rotate teachers and principals to advance STEM programs development. Again, this is a strategy that the Chinese government has put into place to ensure the development of a high-quality educational programs nationwide. And finally, start promoting the development and sharing of STEM curriculums amongst local schools. The next set of recommendations are for administrators. So it's important for administrators to work with STEM teachers during the early stages of program development. Now, although this sounds obvious, it actually does not happen that often, particularly at private schools, as administrators typically invest in developing STEM programs and then bring a teacher in after the fact, after investments in facilities and equipment have been made. 2, promote a unified school-wide understanding of STEM education and emphasize its future role in the school and nation's educational strategy. Again, this is incredibly important, and yet it hardly ever happens. Number 3, offer brief in-services to provide accurate information about STEM programs and to help dispel any misconceptions that might form otherwise. Again, reaching out to community partners can have a huge impact on teaching and learning. However, we don't see this happening much anymore, which is very unfortunate because we can see the benefits that collaboration has from the VT programs of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Learn from the school's STEM teachers and try reaching out to local community partners, which could offer additional guidances and insights. And finally, try sharing best practices with other schools via curriculum sharing, publishing of research papers, or through teacher and principal rotation programs. Again, this is something that the Ministry of Education in China is trying to do, but it can be difficult to encourage private schools that normally compete with one another to do this. Next are recommendations for purchasing departments. Number 1, avoid making uninformed purchasing decisions. Again, this seems incredibly obvious, but most purchasing decisions are being made by finance departments that do not understand the technical aspects of the equipment that's being purchased. This often leads to a lot of bad purchasing decisions, which are made by people who don't understand the nature of the purchases that they're making. 2. Work with STEM teachers to make relevant purchasing equipment. 3. Make purchases that support strategic learning outcomes. As we saw, a lot of schools have relied on easy start guides to build programs. This only results in buying equipment and then trying to make a need for it. However, quality programs will start with the desired learning outcomes, and then we'll look at making strategic purchases that will support those learning outcomes. 4. Look at making complementary equipment purchases. 5. Work with teachers and IT departments to avoid compatibility issues or develop support strategies to aid in the successful implementation of new technologies. Now, compatibility issues is something that I see in a lot of STEM labs, and part of this results from uninformed purchasing decisions being made. Let me give you an example. Many schools are trying to implement a one-to-one or bring your own device program for students. Quite often, these programs are centered around the use of school-wide Apple computer adaptation plans. However, the school then goes on to buy a bunch of equipment for the STEAM lab that is only compatible with Windows computers. Again, it seems like it would be so obvious that it would never happen. Yet this is happening in most schools which I've worked with in the past 10 years. And number 6, avoid investing in proprietary equipment architectures, or if this is necessary, invest heavily into one system architecture only and avoid unnecessary diversification into smaller or similar yet incompatible ecosystems. And the last section is all about recommendations that teachers can use. Number 1, work with the school administrator to develop an educational plan for STEM programs that focus on educational expectations and teachers' needs. Determine the number of courses being offered, how many sections each course will be run, and how many students can safely or viably attend each class section. Determine what equipment will be needed to offer the proposed program, and then compare this with the funds available and for equipment and material purchases. Identify if an asynchronous learning approach is needed to maximize the use of equipment purchases, or if a program with fixed chronological orders will provide better learning outcomes. Set key learning objectives for the course and make strategic purchases that support those learning outcomes. Spread out purchases over the course of several years, while constantly reassessing curriculum objectives and then adjusting purchasing decisions accordingly. And number 7, make additional purchases that complement the pre-existing purchase strategy to strengthen the learning outcomes of the existing program. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. There's no future in STEM and what we can do to fix the problem. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and as always, if you like what you saw, please, and you want to learn more about developing sustainable programs, please make sure you review any of the other presentations that are part of this web series. So in closing, I'd like to say thank you, and I wish you all the best.